Hello there. Come on in and make yourself comfortable. You found Science Blanket, your quiet space for wonder, and I am so glad you've joined me tonight. Have you ever wondered where your computer keeps its thoughts while it's working? All those open windows and half-finished ideas that seem to exist in a high-speed blur? Tonight, we are wrapping ourselves in the story of random access memory, or RAM. We often think of technology as something permanent, stored away in cold, hard drives. But RAM is different. It is a vast, invisible work table that exists only in the present moment. It's a place of incredible speed and light, where millions of tiny electrical pulses hold onto data just long enough for it to be useful, before vanishing into the quiet of the night. It is the short-term memory of our digital world, a temporary sanctuary that clears itself every time the lights go out. As we begin, imagine a grid of millions of microscopic lanterns stretching out into the darkness of a silent room. Each one is winking on and off, holding a tiny piece of a story. You don't need to understand the binary code or the clock speeds tonight. Just let the idea of this weightless, fleeting memory tuck you in. If this blanket of digital light helps you find peace, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our community of sleepy explorers. It helps us keep the stories flowing for every soul in search of a quiet moment. Now, let's take a slow, deep breath together. As you exhale, imagine your own mind like a work table being gently cleared at the end of a long day. Feel the tension leaving your jaw, let your shoulders sink into the support of your bed, and allow your thoughts to drift like light fading from a screen. The work is done, the table is clear, and you are ready to rest. Let's explore the fleeting wonders of RAM together. Random Access Memory. RAM. 3 letters that represent one of the most fundamental components in modern computing, yet the story of how we arrived at this technology stretches back further than most people realize. When we say RAM stands for Random Access Memory, we're describing something quite elegant in its simplicity. It's a type of memory that allows data to be read or written in any order at roughly equal speed. There's no waiting, no sequential searching through information like rewinding a cassette tape to find your favorite song. Every piece of data is equally accessible, equally quick to retrieve. But what does random access really mean? Imagine a library where instead of walking down aisles and scanning shelf after shelf, you could simply think of any book and have it appear instantly in your hands. That's the essence of random access. Any memory location can be accessed in constant time, regardless of its position. Whether the data you need is at the very beginning of the memory or tucked away at the end, the time it takes to reach it remains the same. This uniformity, this consistency of access time, is what makes RAM so powerful and so essential to the way computers operate today. The concept didn't emerge from nowhere. The idea of random access originated with magnetic drum memory back in the 1930s, in an era when computing itself was still in its infancy, still finding its identity. These magnetic drums were cylinders coated with a magnetic material, spinning constantly, holding data in tracks along their surface. Magnetic drum memory provided access by positioning read and write heads over any track on the drum. The heads could move to any position, reaching any piece of stored information without having to pass through all the data that came before it. It was revolutionary for its time, a significant leap forward from purely sequential storage methods. As we moved into the 1940s, computers began to take more recognizable forms, though they were still massive, room-filling machines that bore little resemblance to anything we'd use today. The ENIAC computer, one of the first general-purpose electronic computers, used thousands of vacuum tubes as an early random-access memory equivalent. These glowing glass tubes, each one a small miracle of engineering for its era, could hold and manipulate data electronically. They allowed ENIAC to perform calculations at speeds that seemed impossibly fast compared to mechanical calculators, though by today's standards, ENIAC was glacially slow. Those early systems, as groundbreaking as they were, came with significant drawbacks. Early RAM was often bulky, slow by our current standards, and consumed enormous amounts of power. A single computer might require its own dedicated power station, generating heat that needed elaborate cooling systems to dissipate. The vacuum tubes would fail regularly, requiring constant maintenance. Yet even with these limitations, the advantages of having fast, directly accessible memory were undeniable. Engineers and scientists pushed forward, driven by the potential they could see just beyond the horizon. One of the defining characteristics of RAM, something that remains true to this day, is that RAM is volatile. This means all stored data is lost when power is removed. Turn off a computer, and everything held in RAM simply vanishes, evaporating like morning dew under sunlight. This might seem like a flaw, and in some ways it is an inconvenience, but it's actually a fundamental aspect of how RAM operates. The very mechanisms that make RAM fast and flexible are the same ones that make it unable to retain information without constant power. This volatility distinguishes RAM from long-term storage like disks or solid-state drives. Those storage devices hold onto your files, your documents, your photos, keeping them safe even when the computer is completely shut down for days or weeks or years. RAM, by contrast, is more like a workspace, a desktop where you spread out the papers and tools you're currently using. When you're done for the day and turn off the lights, that workspace clears itself, ready for whatever task comes next. Understanding this distinction helps us appreciate why computers need both types of memory. The need for fast, directly accessible memory shaped early computer architecture in profound ways. Designers had to figure out how to create systems where the processor could reach into memory and grab the exact piece of information it needed, precisely when it needed it, without delay. Every millisecond mattered. Every optimization could mean the difference between a useful machine and an impractical curiosity. Stored program computers, the type of architecture that would eventually dominate and become the standard we use today, required RAM that could be accessed quickly and repeatedly. The revolutionary idea behind stored program computers was that both the data and the instructions for processing that data could live in the same memory space. The computer could read an instruction, execute it, read the next instruction, execute that, all in rapid succession. But for this to work, the memory had to be fast enough that the processor wasn't sitting idle, waiting for information to arrive. It had to be flexible enough that programs could be loaded and changed without rewiring the entire machine. Those early pioneers, working with vacuum tubes and magnetic drums, were laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. They were solving problems that had never been solved before, creating technologies that had never existed. Each improvement in memory technology, each increase in speed or capacity or reliability, opened new possibilities. The computers that helped crack enemy codes during wartime, the systems that calculated trajectories for space missions, the machines that began to transform business and science and communication, all of them depended on having memory that could keep pace with the ambitions of their programmers and users. As you drift toward sleep, consider how far we've come from those first experimental systems. The smartphone in your pocket contains more RAM than the most powerful computers of the 1970s. Your laptop accesses memory billions of times per second, performing operations that would have seemed like magic to those early computer scientists. Yet the fundamental principle remains the same. Random access. Any location, constant time. Data that appears exactly when needed, no matter where it resides in memory. It's a simple idea that changed everything, that made modern computing possible, that continues to evolve even now as engineers push toward ever faster, ever more efficient designs. The story of RAM is the story of making computers think quickly enough to be useful, work efficiently enough to be practical, and respond fluidly enough to feel almost human in their interactions with us. In 1948, something remarkable happened that would push computing forward in ways that even its inventors might not have fully anticipated. The Williams tube became the first practical random access memory, a breakthrough that solved one of the most pressing problems facing computer designers. It was an ingenious solution, storing bits as charged spots on a cathode ray tube's phosphor screen. The same technology that would soon bring television into living rooms around the world was being repurposed to hold the fleeting thoughts of electronic minds. Picture a screen glowing in a darkened laboratory, covered with a pattern of bright and dim spots, each one representing a single bit of information. These weren't images meant for human eyes, but rather a language machines could read, a way of encoding zeros and ones in the presence or absence of electrical charge on phosphor. The beauty of the Williams tube was that those spots could be read and rewritten electronically, quickly, without moving parts or mechanical delays. The Manchester Baby, a computer with an almost affectionate nickname that belied its historical significance, used Williams tube RAM to run the first stored program in June of 1948. It wasn't much by today's standards, barely able to perform what we'd consider simple arithmetic. But it proved a concept that would reshape the world. For the first time, a computer could store its own instructions in memory alongside the data it was processing, reading and executing them in sequence, modifying them if needed. The program and the machine were no longer separate entities. Williams tube RAM could hold up to about 1,000 bits in its most developed forms. 1,000 bits. Today that seems almost laughably small, insufficient to store even a single frame of a low-resolution image. But in that era, 1,000 bits represented a vast improvement over what had come before. It was enough to hold meaningful programs, enough to perform useful calculations, enough to demonstrate that electronic computing had a future. Not everyone took the same path. Technology in that era was branching in multiple directions as different research teams explored different solutions to the same fundamental problems. The EDSAC computer in 1949 used mercury delay line memory as RAM, a technology that sounds almost mystical when you first encounter it. Mercury delay lines stored data acoustically, using sound waves traveling through tubes of liquid mercury. Information would be converted into pulses of sound, sent traveling through the mercury, then converted back into electrical signals at the other end, amplified, and sent back through again in an endless loop. It was an elegant solution in its own way, using the finite speed of sound to create a temporal storage medium. As long as the sound waves kept circulating through the mercury, the data remained available. But there was a significant limitation. Delay line memory was sequential rather than truly random access. You couldn't simply grab any piece of data whenever you wanted it. Instead, you had to wait for the information to come around again as the sound waves completed their circuit through the tube. If the bit you needed had just passed the reading point, You'd have to wait for it to travel all the way around through the mercury before you could access it again. This made delay line memory slower and less flexible than the Williams tube, though it had its own advantages in terms of reliability and cost. Different computers used different technologies based on what their designers prioritized, what resources they had available, what trade-offs they were willing to make between speed and capacity and reliability. But the technology that would truly dominate, that would become synonymous with computer memory for decades to come, was still emerging. Magnetic core memory was invented in 1947, and though it took a few years to develop into a practical technology, once it arrived, it transformed computing. Core memory stored bits using magnetized ferrite rings threaded with wires, creating a three-dimensional lattice of memory that was robust, reliable, and genuinely random access. Each tiny ferrite ring, often no bigger than a pinhead, could be magnetized in one direction to represent a 1, or magnetized in the opposite direction to represent a 0. Wires threaded through the rings in a precise grid pattern, allowing any individual core to be selected and read or written by energizing the correct combination of wires. It was random access in its purest form. Any bit in the entire memory array could be reached in the same amount of time, regardless of where it sat in the three-dimensional matrix of cores. What made magnetic core memory truly special was its semi-permanence. Unlike the Williams tube, which lost all its data the moment power was removed, magnetic core memory retained its state. The ferrite rings stayed magnetized even when the computer was turned off. This didn't make it non-volatile in the modern sense, since reading data from core memory was a destructive process that required the data to be immediately rewritten. But it did mean that a computer could be switched off and back on without losing everything, a significant practical advantage. Core memory became the standard, the technology that powered the computers of the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s. Factories produced vast quantities of these tiny ferrite rings, and patient workers, often women with exceptionally steady hands, would thread impossibly fine wires through them in precise patterns, creating memory planes that would be stacked together into complete memory units. It was painstaking, meticulous work, but the result was memory that was fast enough and reliable enough to meet the growing demands of computing. The technology continued to evolve. Ferrite sheet memory, a thin-film variant of the magnetic core concept, later powered the Apollo guidance computer, the remarkable machine that helped guide astronauts to the moon and back. This variant used thin films of magnetic material rather than individual rings, allowing for even more compact and efficient memory designs. When you consider that the Apollo guidance computer had to work flawlessly in the harsh environment of space, subject to temperature extremes, radiation, and vibration during launch, the reliability of its memory system becomes even more impressive. That computer, with its core rope memory for permanent storage and its ferrite sheet memory for working space, had less memory capacity than a simple digital watch today. Yet it was enough to navigate across 250,000 miles of space, to calculate trajectories and perform the precise maneuvers needed for lunar orbit and landing. The programmers who wrote code for such limited memory had to be extraordinarily efficient, squeezing every possible function out of every available byte, optimizing in ways that modern developers rarely have to consider. These various memory technologies, from Williams tubes glowing in darkened rooms to mercury-filled tubes carrying acoustic echoes to carefully threaded grids of ferrite rings, represented humanity's first successful attempts to give computers something like short-term memory. Each technology had its moment, its particular advantages and limitations, its place in the evolution of computing. Some fell by the wayside quickly, replaced by superior alternatives. Others persisted for decades, good enough and reliable enough that there was no urgent need to replace them until something dramatically better came along. The story of memory technology in the decades following World War II is one of constant experimentation, of engineers trying different approaches to solve the same essential problem. How do you store information in a way that's fast, reliable, affordable, and compact enough to be practical? Twister memory, developed in 1957, represented yet another creative attempt at an answer. It used magnetostrictive wires wrapped with fine wire, creating a system where magnetic fields and mechanical vibrations work together to store and retrieve data. The name itself, Twister, hints at the physical twisting and torsion involved in the technology, a dance of magnetism and metal that could encode information. Twister memory never achieved the widespread adoption of magnetic core, but it found its niche in certain applications where its particular characteristics made it advantageous. It was faster than core in some ways, and the design allowed for interesting configurations that suited specific types of computers. Yet, like so many technologies of that era, it would eventually be overtaken by newer developments, becoming a footnote in the larger narrative of computing history. The 1970s brought another fascinating contender into the arena. Bubble memory stored data as magnetic bubbles in garnet films, using cylindrical magnetic domains that could be moved around within the material like tiny magnetic droplets floating in a crystalline sea. These bubbles could be created, destroyed, moved from place to place, detected, and read. The technology was elegant in theory, offering the promise of high-density storage that was compact and had no moving parts. What made bubble memory particularly interesting was that it was non-volatile. Unlike the RAM technologies that preceded it, bubble memory held onto its data even when power was removed. The magnetic bubbles remained stable in the garnet film, waiting patiently to be read whenever the system powered back up. This seemed like the perfect combination, the speed of RAM with the permanence of storage. Researchers and companies invested significant resources into developing bubble memory, convinced it might represent the future of computer storage. But the future had other plans. Bubble memory lost out to cheaper semiconductor RAM as the economics of chip manufacturing shifted dramatically in favor of silicon-based technologies. Bubble memory required specialized materials and fabrication techniques. The garnet films had to be grown with precise properties. The supporting electronics needed careful design. As semiconductor manufacturing improved and costs plummeted, bubble memory simply couldn't compete on price, even with its technical advantages. By the 1980s, it had largely disappeared from the market, another promising technology that arrived at the wrong moment in history. These magnetic technologies, from core to twister to bubble memory, bridged the gap between early and modern memory. They represented decades of incremental improvement, of engineers pushing magnetic materials to their limits, finding clever ways to store more data in less space with better reliability. But even as these technologies matured, a revolution was brewing in a completely different direction. The transition to semiconductor memory marked a major turning point, one of those moments where the trajectory of technology shifts dramatically. Instead of storing data in magnetic fields or acoustic pulses or charged spots on screens, semiconductor memory used transistors, the same basic building blocks that were transforming all of electronics. Transistors could be switched on or off electronically, incredibly quickly, and they could be manufactured in ever-increasing numbers on silicon chips using photolithography and other techniques borrowed from the printed circuit board industry. Bipolar SRAM was invented in 1963 using non-MOS transistors, representing the first serious attempt to create random access memory entirely from semiconductor components. SRAM stands for Static Random Access Memory, and the static part is important. Unlike the dynamic memory that would come later, static RAM holds its data as long as power is applied, without needing to be constantly refreshed. The bipolar transistors used in this early SRAM were relatively fast but also relatively power-hungry and took up considerable space on the chip. The real breakthrough came shortly after. MOS SRAM followed in 1964 using metal oxide semiconductor technology, a different type of transistor that offered significant advantages in terms of density and power consumption. MOS transistors could be made smaller than bipolar transistors, meaning more of them could fit on a chip. They consumed less power, generated less heat. These characteristics would prove crucial as memory chips grew more complex. But the early days were humble. Early MOS SRAM devices held only dozens of bits. Dozens. Not thousands or millions, but dozens. A modern USB flash drive might hold 1 trillion bits or more. Yet those first chips with their few dozen bits of storage represented something profound, the proof that semiconductor memory could work, that it could be manufactured, that it had a future. Progress came quickly once the foundation was laid. IBM introduced the first monolithic 16-bit SRAM chip in 1965, just a year after MOS SRAM technology emerged. 16-bit still sounds absurdly small today, barely enough to store a single character in modern encoding. But this chip was monolithic, meaning all 16 bits and their supporting circuitry existed on a single piece of silicon. There were no separate components to assemble, no wires to thread through ferrite cores. The entire memory existed as a unified whole, a small rectangle of silicon with metal contacts. That chip was used in the System 360 Model 95 computer, IBM's high-end offering in their revolutionary System 360 line. The System 360 family itself deserves recognition as a landmark in computing history, the first family of computers designed with a consistent architecture where programs written for one model could run on another, from small business machines to large scientific computers. The fact that IBM chose semiconductor memory for the Model 95 signaled their confidence in the technology, their belief that it represented the future. And they were right. Once semiconductor memory proved itself viable, the advantages became overwhelming. Memory chips could be manufactured using the same processes as the processors themselves, creating economies of scale that no magnetic technology could match. As photolithography techniques improved, the transistors on chips could be made smaller and smaller, meaning each new generation could pack more memory into the same space, or the same amount of memory into a smaller space. The cost per bit began to fall, slowly at first, then rapidly. What had once been exotic and expensive became commonplace and affordable. The transition wasn't instantaneous. Magnetic core memory continued to be used through the 1970s in many systems, particularly where reliability mattered more than cutting-edge performance. But the writing was on the wall, etched in silicon. Semiconductor memory would dominate the future, and magnetic technologies, despite their decades of service, would gradually fade into history, remembered by engineers and computer scientists but replaced in every practical sense by the transistor-based memory that continues to evolve and improve even today. As semiconductor memory evolved, two distinct approaches emerged, each with its own philosophy, its own trade-offs between speed and density and cost. Understanding the difference between these two types helps illuminate why computers are designed the way they are, why memory systems have layers and hierarchies rather than being uniform throughout. SRAM cells store data using a feedback loop of transistors, a design that's elegant in its stability. Imagine a circuit where the output feeds back into the input, creating a self-reinforcing loop that holds a value indefinitely. Once you set an SRAM cell to store a 1 or a 0, it maintains that state, locked in place by its own internal feedback, as long as power continues to flow through the circuit. There's a beautiful simplicity to this, a kind of electronic memory that remembers simply by continuously affirming its own state. Most SRAM uses 6 transistors per bit, a design that became standard because it offers the best balance of stability, speed, and manufacturability. 6 transistors might sound like a lot for storing a single bit of information, and in many ways it is. Those 6 transistors take up space on the chip, space that could otherwise be used to store more bits. But they create a memory cell that's robust and incredibly fast, capable of responding to read and write requests in nanoseconds, in billionths of a second. One of the key advantages is that SRAM does not require refresh cycles to retain data. Once you write a value to an SRAM cell, it simply stays there, maintained by the feedback loop, until you either write a different value or remove power entirely. There's no need for the memory controller to constantly check in on each cell, rewriting values before they fade. The memory just works, instantly available whenever the processor needs it. This makes SRAM extremely fast and ideal for caches, those small pools of memory that sit very close to the processor, holding the most frequently accessed data and instructions. When a processor needs information, it checks the cache first, and if the data is there, it can be retrieved almost instantly. SRAM speed makes this possible. Modern processors might have multiple layers of cache, some built directly onto the processor chip itself, all using SRAM because nothing else can match its response time. However, SRAM is expensive and low density compared to the alternative. Those 6 transistors per bit add up quickly. A megabyte of SRAM requires 6 million transistors, and modern computers need gigabytes of memory, not megabytes. Building all of a computer's working memory from SRAM would be prohibitively expensive and would require enormous chips that would be difficult to manufacture and would generate tremendous amounts of heat. There had to be a different approach for bulk memory, something that could store large amounts of data more economically. The answer came in 1966, another pivotal year in the history of memory technology. DRAM was invented using a single transistor and capacitor per bit, a dramatic reduction in complexity compared to SRAM's 6 transistors. DRAM stands for Dynamic Random Access Memory, and that word dynamic tells you something important about how it works. Where SRAM is static, stable, self-maintaining, DRAM is dynamic, constantly changing, requiring active management to keep data alive. Each DRAM cell stores data as an electrical charge on a tiny capacitor. Think of a capacitor as a microscopic bucket that can hold electrical charge. If the bucket is full, that represents a 1. If it's empty, that represents a 0. It's conceptually simple, and the physical implementation is remarkably compact. One transistor acts as a gate, controlling whether charge can flow into or out of the capacitor. One capacitor holds the charge that represents the data. Just 2 components per bit instead of 6. But there's a problem. an inherent limitation in the physics of capacitors at this scale. These charges leak over time and must be refreshed frequently. The capacitors are so small, and the charges they hold so tiny, that they gradually dissipate, bleeding away through imperfect insulation, through quantum tunneling effects, through various mechanisms that are impossible to completely eliminate. Left alone for more than a few milliseconds, a DRAM cell loses its data as the charge drains away to nothing. So the memory controller has to constantly patrol through the memory, reading each cell and writing its value back, replenishing the charge before it fades too far to be reliably detected. Refresh cycles consume power and add complexity to the memory system. The controller must keep track of which rows of memory have been refreshed and when, ensuring that no cell goes too long without being topped up. This happens thousands of times per second, an endless maintenance task happening in the background while the memory is simultaneously serving read and write requests from the processor. It sounds inefficient, and in some ways it is. The refresh cycles waste power and occupy memory bandwidth that could otherwise be used for actual data access. The dynamic nature of DRAM makes it more complex to design around and slightly slower than SRAM in absolute terms. But these drawbacks are overwhelmed by one enormous advantage. Despite this, DRAM enabled far higher memory densities. With only one transistor and one capacitor per bit instead of 6 transistors, DRAM could pack far more bits into the same area of silicon. This meant larger memory chips, more affordable memory chips, memory that could be produced in the quantities needed to meet the growing demands of computing. Through the 1970s and beyond, as computers moved from being rare, expensive machines found only in universities and corporations to common tools found in offices and eventually homes, DRAM made it economically feasible to equip them with meaningful amounts of memory. The trade-off became the defining characteristic of modern memory hierarchies. Small amounts of expensive, fast SRAM for caches, sitting closest to the processor where speed matters most. Large amounts of cheaper, denser DRAM for main memory, providing the working space where programs and data live while the computer is running. Each type of memory optimized for its particular role, working together to create a system that's both fast enough and large enough to be useful. Engineers became adept at designing around DRAM's limitations. Memory controllers grew more sophisticated, managing refresh cycles efficiently, interleaving accesses to hide latency, implementing error correction to catch the occasional bit that flipped despite all precautions. The techniques developed to make DRAM practical became a whole subfield of computer engineering, an art of coaxing maximum performance from memory that, by its nature, required constant attention to keep functioning. As you drift further towards sleep, consider how these technical decisions from decades ago continue to shape the devices you use every day. The laptop or phone or tablet you might be using to listen to these words contains both types of memory, SRAM in the caches and DRAM in the main memory banks, each doing the job it's best suited for. The engineers who first wrestled with these trade-offs, who figured out how to make DRAM reliable despite its need for constant refreshing, who optimized SRAM cells for maximum speed, built the foundation that every subsequent generation has built upon, refined, improved, but never fundamentally changed. The theoretical possibilities of DRAM were one thing, but transforming those possibilities into actual products that people could buy and use required engineering skill, manufacturing capability, and no small amount of courage from companies willing to invest in unproven technology. The Intel 1103 was the first commercial DRAM chip in 1970, a product that would prove to be one of Intel's most important early successes, even more significant in some ways than the microprocessors they would later become famous for. It held 1 kilobit of data, which means 1024 bits, enough to store 128 bytes. By modern standards, it's almost nothing. A single emoji in a text message uses more memory than an entire Intel 1103 chip could hold. But in 1970, a kilobit of semiconductor memory on a single chip represented a breakthrough that would reshape the computer industry. It displaced magnetic core memory, the technology that had dominated for nearly 2 decades, the technology that had seemed so permanent, so entrenched. The displacement happened faster than anyone expected. DRAM's low cost and power efficiency drove its rapid adoption across the industry. Computer manufacturers looked at the numbers and realized they could build machines with more memory for less money using DRAM. The chips were smaller, lighter, drew less power, generated less heat. They didn't require the painstaking hand assembly that core memory needed, with workers threading wires through thousands of tiny ferrite rings. DRAM could be manufactured using the same photolithographic processes as other integrated circuits, meaning production could scale up quickly as demand increased. Within just a few years, core memory began disappearing from new designs. The technology that had taken computers to the moon, that had powered the mainframes running businesses and governments around the world, became obsolete almost overnight in computing terms. Engineers who had spent careers working with core memory had to learn new skills, adapt to new paradigms. It was one of those moments where a generation of technology simply ended, replaced by something fundamentally different. The exploration of DRAM variations continued even as the basic design proved itself. Early calculators also experimented with bipolar DRAM cells, using the faster transistor technology in an attempt to combine DRAM's density advantages with bipolar speed advantages. These experiments largely proved to be dead ends. The extra speed didn't justify the increased complexity and cost, and as Mohs DRAM improved, the performance gap narrowed enough that the simpler, cheaper approach won out. But the real story of DRAM through the 1970s and 80s is the story of density increasing at an almost unbelievable pace. Micron shipped the first 64K DRAM in 1981, a chip that held 65,536 bits. That's 64 times more than the Intel 1103 had held just 11 years earlier. The K stands for kilo, representing 1024 in the binary numbering system that computers use. So 64K meant 64 times 1024, a number that seemed generous at the time, enough memory that programmers started to imagine new possibilities, new types of software that could fit in the available space. By 1984, DRAM densities had reached 256K bits, quadrupling again in just 3 years. Each generation of DRAM required advances in photolithography, in the purity of silicon, in the precision of manufacturing processes. The transistors and capacitors that made up each memory cell had to shrink, getting closer together, packing more tightly onto each square millimeter of silicon. Engineers had to solve new problems at each step. As features got smaller, new sources of interference and noise appeared. Techniques that worked at larger scales failed at smaller ones. The race to higher densities became intensely competitive. Japanese companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, and NEC emerged as major players in the DRAM market, often leading in manufacturing efficiency and quality. American and Korean companies fought to keep pace. Billions of dollars flowed into research and development, into building fabrication plants equipped with ever more sophisticated machinery. The fate of companies, and sometimes entire regional economies, could turn on which firm managed to bring the next generation of DRAM to market first. In 1987, 1 megabit DRAM chips became available, crossing a threshold that felt significant at the time. A megabit meant roughly 1,000,000 bits, enough to store about 128 kilobytes of data. Computers equipped with several megabytes of RAM suddenly became feasible at price points normal businesses could afford. Software grew more ambitious, operating systems more capable. The graphical user interfaces that would make computers accessible to non-technical users required more memory than the command line systems they replaced, and DRAM density improvements made those interfaces practical. The progression didn't stop. It couldn't stop. Once the industry established a rhythm of regular improvements, companies had to keep up or risk being left behind. 4 megabit chips, 16 megabit chips, 64 megabit chips. Each new generation arrived like clockwork, each roughly quadrupling the capacity of the generation before. The manufacturing processes grew more complex, the tolerances tighter, the investments larger. Modern DRAM chips now hold billions of bits each, capacities that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers who designed the Intel 1103. A single module of RAM in a current laptop might contain 8 or 16 gigabytes, which translates to something like 128 billion bits. That's roughly 128 million times more than that first commercial DRAM chip. The comparison almost breaks comprehension. It's like comparing the distance across a room to the distance to the moon. RAM capacity has historically doubled roughly every 2 years, a pattern that held remarkably consistent for decades. This wasn't an accident or a natural law. It was the result of coordinated effort across the entire industry, of companies pushing themselves to maintain a pace of improvement that kept the computing revolution moving forward. The doubling happened so regularly that it became predictable, something that software developers and computer designers could plan around. This trend mirrors Moore's law for memory density, the famous observation made by Gordon Moore in 1965 that the number of transistors on integrated circuits doubled approximately every 2 years. Moore's law has become perhaps the most famous prediction in technology, a self-fulfilling prophecy that guided the semiconductor industry for half a century. The law was never actually a law in the scientific sense, but rather an observation that became a target, a goal that the industry committed itself to achieving through continuous investment and innovation. For memory specifically, the doubling occurred with striking regularity. Engineers knew they had roughly 2 years to figure out how to shrink features, improve yields, overcome whatever technical obstacles stood between one generation and the next. Sometimes it seemed impossible, like hitting a wall that couldn't be breached. But then someone would develop a new technique, a new material, a new approach that opened up another generation or two of improvement. The economic implications were profound. Because capacity doubled while chip size stayed roughly constant, the cost per bit fell by half every 2 years. Memory that cost $1 per megabyte 1 year might cost 50 cents 2 years later, 25 cents 2 years after that. This created a positive feedback loop where cheaper memory enabled new applications, which created demand for even more memory, which justified the investments needed to reach the next generation of density. As your mind drifts in that space between waking and sleeping, imagine the countless hours of human effort represented in this progression. The engineers who redesigned transistors at ever smaller scales. The physicists who modeled quantum effects in structures just atoms thick. The chemists who developed new materials and processes. The manufacturing specialists who built the clean rooms and calibrated the machines. all of them working toward the same goal, year after year, generation after generation, each improvement building on all the ones that came before, creating the memory systems that make modern computing possible. The personal computer revolution didn't begin in a corporate research lab or a university engineering department. It began in garages and spare bedrooms, driven by hobbyists who believed that computing power shouldn't be locked away in air-conditioned rooms accessible only to specialists in white coats. The first home computer RAM expansion appeared in the Altair 8800, a machine that arrived in 1975 as a kit, a collection of parts that buyers had to assemble themselves, soldering components onto circuit boards, hoping they'd gotten everything right. Its base model shipped with no RAM installed, a decision that seems almost absurd now but made perfect sense in the economic realities of the time. Memory was expensive, and the Altair's creators at MITS wanted to keep the base price as low as possible to reach the hobbyist market. The computer arrived as essentially a framework, a processor, and some supporting circuitry, waiting for the owner to add the memory that would make it actually useful. Users could add as little as 256 bytes of memory, barely enough to hold a few dozen instructions or a short message. 256 bytes. Not kilobytes, not megabytes, just bytes. It's hard to convey how constrained that environment was. Every single byte had to be accounted for, every instruction carefully considered. Programmers working with such limited memory had to be creative in ways that modern developers rarely experience, finding clever tricks to accomplish tasks that seemed to require more space than they had available. But even with such severe limitations, people made it work. They wrote programs, they experimented, they learned. The Altair, despite its primitive nature, proved that personal computing was possible, that individuals could own and operate their own computers. It sparked imaginations and inspired a generation of engineers and entrepreneurs who saw the potential for something much bigger. Steve Wozniak's Apple I used 4 kilobytes of DRAM, a significant step up from the minimal configurations of the Altair. 4 kilobytes meant 4096 bytes, 16 times more than that minimal Altair expansion. Wozniak designed the Apple I in 1976, creating a computer that was more complete, more usable out of the box. It came assembled, ready to connect to a television and keyboard, accessible to people who didn't want to solder their own circuit boards. That 4 kilobytes of memory made a real difference. It was enough to run a version of BASIC, a programming language designed to be accessible to beginners. Users could write programs, store small amounts of data, do things that felt genuinely useful rather than purely experimental. The Apple I remained a hobbyist machine, produced in small numbers, but it demonstrated Wozniak's engineering brilliance and set the stage for what would come next. The Apple II became the first successful DRAM-based desktop computer, launched in 1977 with a standard configuration of 4 kilobytes of RAM, expandable up to 48 kilobytes. The Apple II wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a product designed for regular people, housed in a molded plastic case that looked at home on a desk, with color graphics and sound capabilities that made it feel alive and engaging. Schools bought them by the thousands. Small businesses used them for accounting and inventory. Families brought them home for education and entertainment. The expandability mattered enormously. As personal computing grew, RAM capacity became a key differentiator between systems and between price tiers within a product line. Computer advertisements prominently featured memory specifications. A machine with 16 kilobytes cost more than one with 4, but it could run more sophisticated software, handle larger documents, support more complex games. Users learned to think about memory as a resource they needed to manage and optimize. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, personal computer memory grew steadily. Machines shipped with 64 kilobytes, then 128, then larger amounts as DRAM density improved and costs fell. The IBM PC, introduced in 1981, could be configured with up to 640 kilobytes of RAM, an amount that seemed generous at the time, but that would quickly prove limiting as software grew more ambitious. The story of personal computing is, in many ways, the story of memory becoming cheaper and more abundant. RAM prices dropped dramatically over decades, following that pattern of doubling capacity and halving costs every couple of years. The cost per gigabyte fell from thousands of dollars to mere cents over the span of a few decades. Memory that would have cost a small fortune in the early 1980s became so cheap by the 2000s that it barely registered as an expense. This affordability enabled modern software complexity in ways that are easy to overlook. When memory was scarce and expensive, software had to be lean and efficient. Every byte counted, every algorithm had to be optimized. As memory became abundant and cheap, developers could make different trade-offs. They could prioritize development speed over execution efficiency, use libraries and frameworks that consumed more memory but made programming easier, create user interfaces with high-resolution graphics and smooth animations that would have been unthinkable with limited RAM. Modern operating systems routinely use gigabytes of memory just to provide their basic functionality, memory that holds the graphical interface, background services, cache data, and all the complexity that makes computers feel responsive and capable. Applications like web browsers can consume gigabytes on their own, keeping dozens of tabs open simultaneously, each one essentially a separate program running in its own protected memory space. Memory size directly influenced operating system design in profound ways. Early operating systems for personal computers were simple affairs, often loading entirely from floppy disk and running a single program at a time. As memory increased, operating systems became more sophisticated. They added multitasking, the ability to run several programs simultaneously, switching between them seamlessly. They added virtual memory, using hard disk space to extend apparent RAM beyond physical limitations. They added protected memory spaces for each application, preventing one program from corrupting another's data. Each of these features required memory overhead, memory to manage the complexity, to track what was running where, to maintain the illusions of simultaneity and isolation that make modern computing feel natural. The designers of MS-DOS in the early 1980s had to work within the constraints of machines that might have only a few hundred kilobytes of RAM. The designers of Windows 10 or Mac OS or modern Linux distributions assumed the availability of gigabytes, design with that abundance in mind, create systems that would be impossible in more constrained environments. This progression from bytes to kilobytes to megabytes to gigabytes happened gradually enough that each step felt natural, but fast enough that within a single person's career, the change was revolutionary. Engineers who started working with personal computers in the late 1970s, carefully budgeting every byte, might have finished their careers working with systems where memory was so abundant that it rarely needed consideration at all. The fundamental skills remained valuable, but the context changed completely. The democratization of computing depended on this progression. As long as computers required expensive memory and expertise to operate, there remained tools for specialists. As memory became cheap enough that ordinary people could afford computers with meaningful capacity, computing spread outward, reaching into homes and schools and small businesses, transforming how people worked and learned and communicated. The falling cost of RAM wasn't the only factor in that transformation, but it was certainly one of the essential ones, removing a barrier that might otherwise have kept computing confined to a smaller, more privileged audience. As processors became faster through the 1980s and into the 1990s, a growing problem emerged. The CPU could process data at ever-increasing speeds, but the memory system struggled to keep up. DRAM had its own timing, its own rhythm of operation that didn't necessarily align with the processor's clock cycles. This mismatch created inefficiencies, wasted time where the processor sat idle waiting for memory to respond. The solution arrived with a fundamental redesign of how memory communicated with the rest of the system. Synchronous DRAM synchronized memory access with the CPU clock, creating a coordinated dance where memory operations happened in lockstep with processor cycles. Instead of the memory controller sending a request and then waiting an unpredictable amount of time for a response, SDRAM allowed precise timing. The controller knew exactly which clock cycle would deliver the data, could pipeline multiple requests, could orchestrate complex sequences of memory operations with mathematical precision. The first SDRAM chip was released in the early 1990s, marking the beginning of a new era in memory architecture. The synchronous approach brought order to what had been a somewhat chaotic process. Memory timings could be specified in terms of clock cycles rather than absolute nanoseconds, making it easier to design systems that operated reliably across a range of conditions. The improvement in efficiency was immediately noticeable. Systems with SDRAM felt snappier, more responsive, better able to keep the processor fed with the data it needed. But even as SDRAM became standard, engineers were already working on the next improvement. DDR-SDRAM doubled data transfer by using both clock edges, both the rising edge and the falling edge of each clock cycle. Traditional SDRAM transferred data only on the rising edge, when the clock signal went from low to high. DDR, which stands for double data rate, squeezed in a second transfer on the falling edge, when the clock went from high back to low. This effectively doubled the bandwidth without requiring the memory chips themselves to run at higher clock speeds. DDR generations continued increasing speed and lowering voltage with each iteration. DDR2 arrived, then DDR3, then DDR4, each generation bringing faster transfer rates and improvements in power efficiency. The voltage reductions were particularly important for mobile devices and laptops, where every watt of power consumption translated directly to battery life. Lower voltage meant less heat generation, which meant simpler cooling requirements, which meant smaller, lighter devices. DDR5 operates at significantly reduced voltage for efficiency, running at 1.1 volts compared to the 1.2 volts of DDR4 or the higher voltages of earlier generations. That might seem like a trivial difference, but across billions of transistors switching billions of times per second, small voltage reductions add up to meaningful power savings. DDR5 also brought architectural improvements, on-die error correction that catches and fixes certain types of memory errors before they can affect the system, better signal integrity for more reliable operation at high speeds. Modern DDR5 supports extremely high transfer rates, measured in millions of transfers per second. Modules rated for 4,800 megatransfers per second or higher are common, with high-end modules pushing even further. At these speeds, the physical design of the memory module becomes critical. The printed circuit board traces that connect chips must be carefully designed to maintain signal integrity. The connectors must be precisely manufactured. Even the way modules are inserted into their sockets can affect performance. RAM modules are often installed in matched pairs, a practice that became standard as memory controllers evolved to support multi-channel architectures. Dual-channel mode doubles memory bandwidth by allowing the memory controller to access two modules simultaneously, effectively creating two parallel paths for data to flow between the processor and memory. It's like widening a highway from one lane to two, doubling the traffic capacity without requiring vehicles to drive any faster. The performance benefit is substantial for many workloads. Applications that move large amounts of data, video editing software, scientific simulations, games with detailed textures and complex scenes, all benefit from the increased bandwidth that dual-channel operation provides. The matched pairs requirement exists because the memory controller needs modules with identical specifications to maintain synchronization across both channels. Mixing different speeds or capacities can work, but typically forces the system to operate at the speed of the slower module or disables dual-channel operation entirely. RAM ranks refer to independent sets of memory chips on a module, a concept that adds another layer of complexity to memory organization. A rank is essentially a set of chips that can be accessed simultaneously, working together to provide the full width of data that the memory controller expects. A single rank module has one set of chips. A dual rank module has two sets, typically mounted on opposite sides of the circuit board, though advanced packaging techniques now allow dual rank configurations on a single side. Dual rank memory can improve performance through interleaving, allowing the memory controller to access one rank while the other is busy with internal operations like pre-charging for the next access. It's another form of parallelism, another way to hide latency and keep data flowing steadily. The benefit isn't as dramatic as going from single channel to dual channel, but in memory-intensive applications, every optimization matters. Every % of improvement in bandwidth or reduction in latency translates to faster completion times. The complexity of modern memory systems is remarkable when you consider how far we've come from those early days of magnetic cores and Williams tubes. Modern memory modules contain multiple chips, each chip containing billions of transistors, all operating in precise coordination, synchronized to clock signals running at hundreds of millions of cycles per second, managing data flows that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. Yet from the user's perspective, memory just works. You install modules in the appropriate slots, the system recognizes them, configures itself appropriately, and data flows back and forth seamlessly. The incredible engineering that makes this possible remains hidden, abstracted away behind layers of firmware and operating system drivers and hardware protocols. It's one of the quiet triumphs of modern computing, the way complexity has been tamed and packaged and made reliable enough that most people never have to think about it. The synchronous revolution that began with SD-RAM fundamentally changed the relationship between processors and memory. The tight coordination, the ability to predict and optimize memory access patterns, the steady increases in bandwidth through DDR generations, all of these advances helped ensure that memory could keep pace with ever faster processors. Without these innovations, the performance improvements in CPUs would have been partially wasted, the processor spending more and more time waiting for data, unable to fully utilize its capabilities. As you sink deeper into relaxation, consider the rhythm of it all. Clock cycles pulsing millions of times per second. Data transfers synchronized to rising and falling edges. Multiple channels operating in parallel. ranks interleaving their operations. It's a symphony of timing and coordination, an electronic dance performed at speeds beyond human perception, yet somehow it all works together, reliably, predictably, enabling everything from simple web browsing to the most demanding computational tasks. The engineers who designed these systems had to think about timing at nanosecond scales, about signal integrity over distances measured in millimeters, about coordinating operations across multiple chips and modules and channels. Their success is measured in the seamless experience of modern computing, in the fact that memory has largely ceased to be a bottleneck, ceased to be something users need to actively manage or worry about. The demands placed on computer memory aren't uniform across all applications. Different tasks stress the memory system in different ways, and as computing diversified beyond general-purpose tasks, specialized memory types emerged to serve specific needs. Graphics workloads drove the creation of specialized RAM types, born from the recognition that rendering images, especially moving images at high frame rates, required memory optimized for patterns of access quite different from those of traditional computing tasks. When you're displaying graphics, the memory system faces a constant, relentless stream of data requests. Textures need to be fetched, frame buffers updated, geometry data streamed to rendering pipelines. The sheer volume of data moving back and forth between the graphics processor and memory is staggering, far exceeding what typical applications demand. GDDR-RAM optimized memory for high graphics bandwidth, prioritizing throughput over latency, designed to deliver massive amounts of data per second even if each individual access took slightly longer than standard system RAM. GDDR stands for Graphics Double Data Rate, and it evolved through its own sequence of generations parallel to system DDR memory but optimized differently. GDDR memory runs at higher clock speeds and uses wider buses to maximize bandwidth. The power consumption is higher than standard DDR, but in graphics cards that already consume substantial power and have dedicated cooling solutions, this trade-off makes sense. The memory sits on the graphics card itself, physically close to the GPU, connected by wide buses that would be impractical for system memory. Video RAM supports simultaneous access by CPU and GPU, allowing both processors to work with the same data without constant transfers between different memory pools. In some architectures, particularly integrated graphic systems where the GPU is part of the same chip as the CPU, they share the same physical memory. In discrete graphics cards, the video RAM is separate, but data can still be shared through various mechanisms, copied when needed between system memory and graphics memory. As demands for graphics performance continued escalating, driven by higher resolution displays, more complex game engines, virtual reality applications, and professional visualization tools, even GDDR's impressive bandwidth began to seem insufficient. The solution came from rethinking the physical architecture of memory entirely. High-bandwidth memory stacks DRAM dies vertically, placing multiple layers of memory chips one on top of another in a three-dimensional structure rather than spreading them across a flat module. HBM achieves massive bandwidth using through-silicon vias, microscopic vertical connections that pass through the silicon itself, linking the stacked memory dies together and connecting them to the processor below. These connections are much shorter than the traces on a traditional circuit board, and there are many more of them, thousands of connections instead of hundreds. The result is bandwidth measured in hundreds of gigabytes per second, far exceeding what's possible with conventional memory architectures. The manufacturing complexity of HBM is considerable. Stacking dies requires precise alignment. Drilling through silicon vias demands advanced fabrication techniques. Managing heat in a 3D stack where chips are literally on top of each other presents thermal challenges. But for applications that need maximum memory bandwidth, applications like artificial intelligence training, high-performance computing, advanced graphics workstations, the benefits justify the costs and complexity. While some applications pushed for maximum performance regardless of power consumption, others evolved in a completely different direction. Mobile computing, smartphones and tablets and ultra-portable laptops needed to prioritize energy efficiency above all else. LPDDR reduces power consumption for mobile devices, sacrificing some performance to achieve dramatically lower power draw. LPDDR stands for Low Power Double Data Rate, and it represents a different set of engineering trade-offs than either standard DDR or graphics-focused GDDR. Mobile RAM operates at lower voltages to save energy, with each generation pushing voltages down further while maintaining acceptable performance. The memory in your smartphone likely runs at less than a volt, sipping power so efficiently that the memory subsystem contributes only a small fraction of the device's overall energy consumption. This efficiency comes from careful design of every aspect of the memory, from the transistors themselves to the protocols used for communication between the memory and processor. But memory hierarchy doesn't end with main RAM, whether that's DDR or GDDR or LPDDR or HBM. There's another critical layer sitting even closer to the processor. Cache memory sits between the CPU and main RAM, a small amount of extremely fast memory that stores copies of data the processor is likely to need next. Cache RAM stores frequently accessed data for ultra-low latency, responding in just a few clock cycles compared to the dozens or even hundreds of cycles needed to fetch data from main memory. The principle behind cache is locality, both temporal and spatial. Temporal locality means that data accessed recently is likely to be accessed again soon. Spatial locality means that data near recently accessed data is also likely to be accessed soon. Cache exploits these patterns, automatically copying data from main memory into the cache when it's first accessed, keeping it there in case it's needed again, evicting the least recently used data when space is needed for something new. Modern CPUs use multiple cache levels, typically 3, each level larger and slower than the one before it but still faster than main memory. The first level cache, L1, is the smallest and fastest, often split into separate caches for instructions and data, built directly into the processor core itself. It might hold only a few dozen kilobytes, but those kilobytes can be accessed in just 2 or 3 clock cycles, providing data as fast as the processor can use it. The second level cache, L2, is larger, perhaps a few hundred kilobytes or a megabyte, taking slightly longer to access but still dramatically faster than main memory. The third level cache, L3, might be several megabytes or even tens of megabytes in high-end processors, shared among multiple cores, acting as a final buffer before requests have to go all the way out to main memory. This hierarchy exists because physics and economics make it impossible to build large amounts of extremely fast memory. The SRAM used for cache is fast because of its design with multiple transistors per bit, but that same design makes it expensive and low density. You can't build gigabytes of L1 cache, not at any reasonable cost or power consumption. So the memory system is stratified, with tiny amounts of incredibly fast cache feeding from modest amounts of very fast cache feeding from larger amounts of fast cache feeding from gigabytes of merely pretty fast main memory, all working together to hide the latency of each level below it. The effectiveness of this hierarchy depends on sophisticated algorithms built into the processor's cache controller. which data to keep in cache and which to evict, how to predict what the processor will need next, how to manage coherency when multiple cores might be working with the same data. All of these problems require clever solutions implemented in hardware that makes decisions in real time, every clock cycle, adapting to the behavior of whatever software happens to be running. When everything works well, when cache hit rates are high and data flows smoothly through the hierarchy, the processor experiences an effective memory system that feels much faster than the main memory actually is. Most memory requests are satisfied from cache, only occasionally requiring the longer journey out to DRAM and back. When things work poorly, when the data access patterns defeat the cache predictions, performance can fall dramatically as the processor stalls repeatedly, waiting for data to arrive from main memory. The specialization of memory types, the creation of GDDR for graphics and LPDDR for mobile devices and HBM for bandwidth-intensive applications, alongside the cache hierarchy that mediates access to main memory, all of this complexity exists to match memory systems to their specific tasks. There's no single type of memory that's optimal for everything, no one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, modern computing devices contain multiple types of memory, each optimized for its particular role, working together to create the illusion of a unified, fast, responsive memory system that can handle whatever demands software places on it. As memory chips packed more and more transistors into smaller and smaller spaces, as operating voltages dropped, as speeds increased, a new concern emerged that had been less critical in earlier, simpler systems. Error detection became critical as memory density increased, born from the recognition that cosmic rays, alpha particles from packaging materials, electrical noise, and quantum effects could occasionally flip bits in memory, changing zeros to ones or ones to zeros without warning. In systems with relatively small amounts of memory, the probability of such an error was low enough to be largely ignored. But as memory grew to gigabytes and then hundreds of gigabytes, the odds of experiencing a bit flip during normal operation increased proportionally. A single corrupted bit might crash a program, corrupt a file, produce incorrect calculation results. For critical applications, this was unacceptable. Parity bits were an early method for detecting errors, a simple scheme that added one extra bit for every byte of data. This parity bit was set so that the total number of 1 bits in the byte plus the parity bit was always even, or always odd depending on whether you used even or odd parity. When reading data back, the system would count the bits again. If the count didn't match the expected parity, an error had occurred. Parity could detect that something had gone wrong, but it couldn't correct the error or even identify which bit was corrupted. If parity failed, the system would typically halt, displaying an error message, forcing a restart and hoping the problem didn't recur. It was better than silently accepting corrupted data, but it wasn't a complete solution, especially for systems that needed to keep running even when errors occurred. The more sophisticated approach came with error correction codes. ECC RAM can detect and correct single-bit errors, and detect but not correct most multi-bit errors. ECC stands for Error Correcting Code, and it uses additional bits beyond simple parity to encode information that allows the memory controller to not only detect errors but to determine which bit is wrong and flip it back to the correct value, all transparently, without software ever knowing anything went wrong. ECC is widely used in servers and critical systems where reliability matters more than cost. The extra memory chips needed to store the error correction codes add expense, and the processing required to generate and check codes adds slight latency. But for systems handling important data, running services that need high uptime, the trade-off is obvious. Banks, scientific computing facilities, cloud service providers, all rely heavily on ECC memory to maintain data integrity. The need for ECC reflects an uncomfortable truth about modern memory. Typical RAM experiences occasional bit errors over time, with error rates that vary depending on many factors including the quality of the memory chips, operating conditions, altitude, even the time of day and level of solar activity affecting cosmic ray flux. In a large data center with thousands of servers, each with hundreds of gigabytes of memory, bit errors occur constantly. ECC catches and corrects them before they cause problems. For home users and typical business computers, the risk is deemed acceptable and non-ECC memory is standard, saving cost. The occasional error might cause a program to crash or produce a corrupted file, but these events are rare enough that most users never experience them, or attribute them to software bugs rather than hardware errors when they do occur. As memory systems grew larger, another challenge emerged. Registered DIMMs buffer signals to support more modules per channel, addressing the electrical loading problems that occur when many memory modules share the same bus. Each additional module adds capacitance and other electrical effects that can degrade signal integrity. Registered DIMMs include a register chip that buffers the control and address signals, isolating the electrical load of the memory chips from the memory controller. This allows systems to support many more memory modules than would otherwise be possible, enabling servers with hundreds of gigabytes or even terabytes of RAM. The register adds 1 clock cycle of latency, a small performance penalty, but for systems where maximum capacity matters more than minimum latency, it's a worthwhile trade. Registered memory is also called buffered memory, and it's another feature found primarily in server and workstation systems rather than consumer hardware. Even with gigabytes of physical RAM, some applications need more memory than is physically installed, or systems need to run more programs simultaneously than can fit in available RAM. Virtual memory uses storage as an extension of RAM, creating an abstraction where programs see a large, contiguous address space even though physical RAM is limited. The operating system and memory management hardware work together to move data between RAM and disk storage as needed, keeping active data in RAM and pushing inactive data out to disk. Virtual RAM is much slower due to disk latency, orders of magnitude slower than even the slowest RAM. When a program accesses data that's been paged out to disk, everything stops while the operating system reads it back into RAM, an operation that might take milliseconds with an SSD or tens of milliseconds with a traditional hard drive. Compare that to the tens of nanoseconds needed to access data already in RAM. The difference is vast. Systems that rely heavily on virtual memory, constantly swapping data between RAM and disk, feel sluggish and unresponsive. The disk activity light blinks constantly, programs stutter and freeze during the pauses. It's a last resort mechanism, useful for preventing out-of-memory crashes, enabling occasional access to data that doesn't fit in RAM, but not a substitute for having adequate physical memory for your workload. Despite all the advances in memory technology, despite the exponential increases in capacity and bandwidth, memory has not kept pace with processor improvements. The memory wall describes the growing CPU-RAM speed gap, the widening disparity between how fast processors can execute instructions and how fast memory can supply the data those instructions need to operate on. Processor clock speeds increased dramatically through the 1990s and early 2000s, but memory latency improved much more slowly. The time to access main memory, measured in processor clock cycles, grew from a handful of cycles in early systems to dozens or hundreds of cycles in modern processors. If not for cache memory and various latency hiding techniques, This gap would cripple performance, leaving processors idle most of the time waiting for data. This gap influences modern processor design in fundamental ways. The elaborate cache hierarchies in modern CPUs exist primarily to bridge the memory wall, to provide fast access to frequently used data without going all the way out to main memory. Processors include sophisticated prefetchers that try to predict memory access patterns and fetch data before it's explicitly requested. Out-of-order execution allows processors to continue with other work while memory requests are in flight. Entire research fields focus on optimizing memory access patterns, on designing algorithms and data structures that maximize cache efficiency, on compressing data to reduce memory bandwidth requirements. The memory wall has shaped computer architecture as profoundly as any other single factor, driving decisions about how processors are designed, how software is written, how systems are configured. Some researchers worry that the memory wall will eventually halt progress in computing performance, that even if processors continue to improve, the inability to feed them data fast enough will limit what can be achieved. Others argue that new memory technologies, new architectures, new approaches to computing will find ways around the wall. The tension between processor speed and memory speed remains one of the central challenges in computer architecture, unlikely to be fully resolved anytime soon. As your consciousness fades towards sleep, consider this strange asymmetry, this mismatch between the components of a computer system. Processors that can execute billions of instructions per second, held back by memory that takes hundreds of cycles to respond to requests. The elaborate workarounds, the cache hierarchies and prefetching engines and out-of-order execution all exist to paper over this fundamental mismatch. It's a reminder that computer systems are not perfectly balanced designs but rather collections of compromises, each component improving at its own rate, with engineers constantly adjusting to maintain overall system performance despite the growing gaps between subsystems. For all its success, for all the decades DRAM has dominated as the standard memory technology, its fundamental characteristics impose limitations that researchers have long sought to overcome. New memory technologies aim to overcome DRAM limitations, exploring different physical mechanisms for storing data that might offer combinations of features impossible with traditional DRAM. The Holy Grail would be memory that's as fast as SRAM, as dense as DRAM, non-volatile like flash storage, and inexpensive to manufacture. No single technology achieves all of these goals, but various approaches make different trade-offs. Phase-change memory offers non-volatility with fast access, using materials that can switch between crystalline and amorphous states with different electrical properties. In the crystalline state, the material has low resistance. In the amorphous state, resistance is high. These states are stable without power, making the memory non-volatile, but they can be switched relatively quickly by applying appropriate voltage pulses that heat the material enough to change its structure. Phase-change memory has been in development for decades, with various companies demonstrating products and even bringing some to market, though widespread adoption has remained elusive. The technology offers intriguing possibilities: faster than flash storage, denser than DRAM, non-volatile unlike either. But manufacturing challenges, cost issues, and questions about long-term reliability and endurance have limited its commercial success so far. Another approach uses magnetic properties rather than electrical charge or phase changes. MRAM stores data using magnetic states, specifically the orientation of magnetization in thin film structures. Each memory cell contains magnetic materials that can be magnetized in one direction to represent a 1, or the opposite direction to represent a 0. Reading the state involves detecting the resistance, which changes based on the relative orientation of magnetic layers, a phenomenon called magnetoresistance. MAM does not require refresh cycles, a significant advantage over DRAM. The magnetic states are stable indefinitely without power, yet can be read and written quickly, potentially as fast as SRAM. Various forms of MRAM have been developed, with names like spin-transfer torque MRAM and spin-orbit torque MRAM referring to different mechanisms for switching the magnetic states. Some MRAM is already used in specialized applications where its unique characteristics provide advantages, though it hasn't displaced DRAM in mainstream computing. Ferroelectric materials provide yet another mechanism for storing data. FERAM uses ferroelectric materials for low-power non-volatile memory, relying on materials that maintain electrical polarization without applied voltage. The polarization can be switched by applying an electric field, and the current required is relatively low, making FERAM attractive for low-power applications. FERAM has found niche uses in smart cards, automotive systems, and industrial equipment where its combination of fast access, low power, and non-volatility makes sense. ReRAM, or resistive RAM, stores data by changing material resistance through the formation and dissolution of conductive filaments within an insulating material. Apply a voltage and metal atoms migrate through the insulator, forming a path that reduces resistance. Reverse the voltage and the path breaks, resistance returns to a high state. ReRAM is simpler in structure than some other emerging memories, potentially easier and cheaper to manufacture, but questions about variability and reliability have slowed its adoption. Some of these emerging technologies offer capabilities beyond simple data storage. Some emerging RAM supports analog computation for AI workloads, using the physical properties of memory cells to perform calculations directly within the memory array rather than shuttling data back and forth to a separate processor. This approach, sometimes called in-memory computing or compute-in-memory, could dramatically improve efficiency for certain types of neural network operations where the same data is used repeatedly in similar calculations. The idea is to exploit the fact that many AI workloads involve matrix multiplications and similar operations that could be performed using the analog properties of memory cells. Instead of reading values, sending them to a processor, computing results, and writing them back, the computation happens in place, reducing data movement and potentially offering massive improvements in both speed and energy efficiency. It's a radical departure from conventional computing architectures, and research in this area remains active. The boundary between memory and storage has also been blurring. Persistent RAM blends memory speed with data retention, offering access times much faster than traditional storage while maintaining data when power is removed. Technologies in this space aim to fill the gap between volatile memory and non-volatile storage, creating a new tier in the memory hierarchy that could fundamentally change how systems are designed. Optane-class memory once bridged RAM and storage tiers, using 3D X-point technology to provide non-volatile memory with access times measured in hundreds of nanoseconds rather than the milliseconds typical of SSDs or microseconds of DRAM. Intel's Optane memory could be used in different modes, either as extremely fast storage or as persistent memory that appeared to the operating system as RAM that retained its contents across reboots. The promise was significant. Imagine databases that never needed to reload from disk, systems that booted instantly because program state persisted in memory, new application architectures that didn't need to distinguish between working memory and permanent storage. Some of these visions were realized in specialized systems, but Optane struggled to find a broad market. The performance gap between it and DRAM was still substantial, while the cost gap between it and SSDs made it seem expensive. Intel eventually discontinued most Optane products, though the technology demonstrated possibilities that future memory technologies might realize more successfully. Future systems aim for unified memory hierarchies, architectures where the distinctions between different types of memory become less rigid, where data doesn't need to be explicitly moved between tiers but rather resides in a continuous spectrum from fastest to largest to most persistent. Some of this unification is already happening. Unified memory architectures in Apple's M-series processors share the same physical memory between CPU and GPU, eliminating the need to copy data between separate memory pools. More radical visions imagine systems where every byte of storage is directly addressable as memory, where non-volatile memory with near-DRAM performance allows systems to maintain persistent state without traditional storage devices, where the operating system's responsibilities shift from managing distinct memory and storage systems to managing a single unified space with varying performance characteristics at different points. These future architectures might eliminate much of the software complexity that currently exists to manage data movement between memory and storage, to checkpoint program state, to recover from crashes. They might enable new programming models where persistence is automatic, where the distinction between memory and storage largely disappears from the programmer's perspective. But significant challenges remain. The perfect memory technology, fast as SRAM, dense as DRAM, non-volatile as flash, cheap to manufacture, durable through countless write cycles, doesn't exist yet. Each emerging technology offers some advantages while accepting trade-offs in other areas. The economics of semiconductor manufacturing favor technologies that can leverage existing production infrastructure, creating barriers to adoption for radically new approaches. DRAM has benefited from decades of optimization, billions of dollars of investment in manufacturing capability, entire ecosystems of controllers and interfaces and standards built around it. Displacing it requires not just a technology that's better in some ways, but one that's enough better to justify the costs and risks of transition. This is why DRAM has persisted as the dominant memory technology for so long, why emerging alternatives have struggled to gain traction even when they offer compelling advantages. Yet research continues, driven by the recognition that DRAM's fundamental limitations, its volatility, its need for refresh, the slowing pace of density improvements as manufacturing processes approach atomic scales, will eventually force a transition to something new. Whether that transition happens gradually, with new memory types filling niches and slowly expanding their roles, or whether some breakthrough technology suddenly displaces DRAM the way semiconductor memory once displaced magnetic cores, remains to be seen. What seems certain is that the memory technologies of the future will differ significantly from what we use today, continuing the evolution that has marked every era of computing history, adapting to new demands, enabling new possibilities, overcoming old limitations only to encounter new ones that will require yet further innovation. The way memory connects to processors and to other system components has always been critical to performance, but traditional architectures where each processor has its own dedicated memory are beginning to show their limitations in certain scenarios. Interconnects are reshaping how RAM is deployed, moving beyond the model where memory modules plug directly into slots on a motherboard serving a single processor, toward more flexible architectures where memory can be shared, pooled, and allocated dynamically across multiple systems. CXL enables shared memory pools across servers, using the Compute Express Link standard to create high-speed connections between processors and memory that isn't physically located in the same chassis. CXL stands for Compute Express Link, an open standard that allows processors, accelerators, and memory devices to communicate efficiently, maintaining cache coherency across the interconnect, making remote memory appear nearly as accessible as local memory. CXL allows RAM to be dynamically allocated where needed, a fundamental shift in data center architecture. Instead of each server having a fixed amount of memory that sits idle when that server is lightly loaded while another server struggles with insufficient memory, CXL enables memory pooling where resources can be assigned flexibly based on current demand. One server running a memory-intensive database query could temporarily use memory from the shared pool, then release it when done, allowing another server to use those same resources for a different workload. The implications for efficiency and cost in large-scale computing environments are significant. Data centers could reduce overall memory capacity while maintaining performance by sharing resources more effectively. The memory that exists could be utilized more fully, with less sitting idle. But implementing memory pooling requires sophisticated management software, introduces new latency considerations since accessing remote memory over CXL is slower than accessing local memory, and demands careful attention to reliability since memory failures could now affect multiple systems. NVMe integration with memory reduces latency in data centers, blurring the boundary between storage and memory even further. NVMe, which stands for Non-Volatile Memory Express, is a protocol designed for fast solid-state storage, but as storage devices have become faster, the overhead of traditional storage protocols has become a bottleneck. Direct integration between NVMe devices and memory systems, bypassing some of the layers of abstraction that typically separate them, can reduce latency and improve performance for workloads that frequently access persistent data. The rise of new computing paradigms creates new demands on memory systems. Edge computing increases demand for fast, efficient RAM, pushing computation out to the edges of networks, closer to where data is generated and consumed. Edge devices, sensors in industrial equipment, processors in autonomous vehicles, servers in cellular base stations, all need memory that's efficient enough to run on limited power budgets while being fast enough to process data with minimal latency. Edge computing often involves harsh environmental conditions, temperature extremes, vibration, limited cooling, making reliability and robustness particularly important. The memory solutions for edge computing might differ from those in climate-controlled data centers, prioritizing different characteristics, accepting different trade-offs. Security has become an increasing concern as computing systems handle more sensitive data. Memory encryption protects data while it resides in RAM, ensuring that even if an attacker gains physical access to a system or uses sophisticated techniques to read memory contents, they see only encrypted data without access to the decryption keys. Modern processors include hardware support for memory encryption, performing encryption and decryption on the fly as data moves between the processor and memory with minimal performance impact. Memory encryption addresses threats like cold boot attacks where an attacker might cool RAM chips to extend their data retention, remove them from a system, and read their contents in another system, or attacks where malicious hardware might attempt to snoop memory bus traffic. As security threats evolve, protection of data in memory becomes as important as protecting data in storage or in transit across networks. Looking further ahead, entirely new computing paradigms will require rethinking memory systems from first principles. Quantum computers will require specialized memory systems, memory that can store and manipulate quantum states, maintain quantum coherence despite environmental noise, interface between quantum and classical computing domains. The memory requirements for quantum computers differ so fundamentally from conventional computing that entirely new technologies are being developed: cryogenic memory systems, superconducting circuits, systems that operate at temperatures near absolute zero. Even within conventional computing, researchers continue exploring radical new approaches. Optical memory research promises higher density and efficiency, using light instead of electricity to store and retrieve data. Optical approaches could potentially overcome some of the bandwidth limitations of electrical interconnects, enable new forms of parallel access, reduce power consumption. Research in this area spans decades, with various approaches investigated, but practical optical memory systems remain largely in the laboratory, facing significant engineering challenges before they could become commercial products. Meanwhile, evolutionary improvements to existing technologies continue. 3D stacking continues to boost bandwidth and capacity, building on the success of HBM to create ever more densely packed memory systems. Future memory might stack dozens of dies, use advanced cooling techniques to manage thermal challenges, employ sophisticated error correction and redundancy to maintain reliability despite the increased complexity. The trajectory of memory technology over the past 80 years, from magnetic drums and Williams tubes to multi-gigabyte DRAM modules and emerging non-volatile memories, has been one of continuous innovation, of solving one set of challenges only to encounter new ones, of technology enabling applications that create demand for even better technology. RAM remains a foundational technology shaping computing's future, as critical now as it was in the earliest stored program computers, perhaps even more so as the demands placed on memory systems grow in complexity and sophistication. Every application you run, every web page you load, every video you watch, every calculation performed, every sensor reading processed, depends on memory systems that have evolved through decades of engineering effort. The invisible complexity of modern RAM, the intricate dance of signals and timing, the sophisticated error correction and management, the hierarchies of cache and main memory and storage, all work together to create the illusion of simple, instant access to any data whenever needed. As you finally drift into sleep, let this knowledge settle gently into your thoughts. The random access memory that powers modern computing is not random at all in its design, but rather the result of countless careful decisions, refinements, optimizations. From those first experimental systems where memory was measured in dozens of bits to today's systems with billions of bits, from vacuum tubes and magnetic cores to transistors and capacitors smaller than viruses, the story of RAM is fundamentally a story of human ingenuity, of pushing against physical limits, of finding clever solutions to seemingly impossible problems. It's a story that continues to unfold, with new chapters being written in research laboratories and engineering facilities around the world, ensuring that whatever computing becomes in the decades ahead, memory will evolve alongside it, adapting, improving, enabling new possibilities that we can barely imagine today. Sleep well, knowing that the technology you've learned about tonight will continue its quiet work, storing and retrieving data billions of times per second, making the digital world function, invisible but essential, now and into the future.